Wouldn't that tie into like narrative therapy, reframing, or shifting a perspective? Like it could,
Elaborate on that for us, please. Or for me in particular, being a non-psychology person.
so my understanding of narrative therapy is that it helps you to tell a story in a different way.
Hmm.
Like, and if somebody knows more than me, please correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding is that you want to help the client, and you would say, yes, this situation happened to you, and now you're having your healing, and now you're working through it, and it's a gradual process. And once they can look at the story as like, oh no, yes, this horrible trauma happened to me. And yes, that's true, but I'm choosing to see it from this healed perspective. You
That's
know,
excellent.
I think that, that could be a really good way of framing it, especially if people get offended by saying like, oh, think about it differently, because it's not just like an automatic thing. It's something you have to do over time,
Right.
and you process those feelings, and you have to move forward, and you have to think about it in a more positive light. Like, this trauma happened, but I've healed, or this trauma happened, but now I'm stronger as a human being, and I know how to identify my feelings, or whatever it may be.
Very good. Yeah, I like that a lot. And that's something I think as a counselor, that's part of what you can help do is provide alternate narratives. Um,
Absolutely.
Back to Nietzsche, he would not want anyone else's narrative, right? So you'd have to get him to think it's his own narrative, but that would be a good counselor too. Like, can you think of any other ways you could frame this in your life? Or is it only this one way? Can you see any other angles? But sometimes people can't, especially if it's fresh, a fresh trauma. They're so overwhelmed, they're not ready to come out of the pit and see different perspectives yet. They may not be able to. And that's where we talked about the difference between sympathy and empathy, where we're not just up here feeling bad for them, we come down into the pit with them as much as we're able. And maybe it's just sitting with them. They might not even be able to communicate at this point, and
Mhm.
just to be in the presence with them. And
Absolutely.
eventually, maybe they'll be able to peek their head out and begin to get different perspectives.
Mhm.
And that's where that trust and relationship, um, even though this was in the spiritual context, I think it would apply to you all as well. I learned this from my buddy Steve Witten. He was the pastor of Grace. He still is pastor of Grace Fellowship Church in San Diego. He's a professor at San Diego Christian, teaches theology and Bible. And he told me this as a young man. He said, ministry is grounded in relationship. And I would say the same for therapy. Therapy is grounded in relationship. He said, to the degree you have a relationship with someone is the degree that you'll be able to minister to them. And that really stuck with me as a young man. And he explained, he says, when you have a relationship with someone and you haven't been consistent and there for them in the good times and the bad times, the highs and lows, you have kind of earned a voice in their life. Whereas if it's someone you haven't invested in, you haven't suffered with, you haven't cared for, you really haven't earned the right to speak into their life. And I really appreciated that. And that was what he was so good at as a pastor. He was a true pastor shepherd, where he would be amongst the sheep. He would live with them. He would eat with them. He would share their hopes, dreams, fears, sorrows. And I noticed that as a professor, the students I had a relationship with, I could be much more direct with. The students I didn't, I was much more general. I'd still engage them, but not intimately, not in their deep things. But and sometimes people would bring up stuff like a student would be acting out, or they weren't dressed appropriately, or they were breaking some of the school policies, whatever it happened to be. If it was a student I had a relationship with, I would directly confront them and ask them. If it was someone I didn't, I would find someone that did have a relationship with to confront them, because I didn't want to be that guy around campus that was trying to police and monitor everyone. But people I had a relationship and cared for, I certainly wanted to speak into their lives. Just briefly, Gestalt therapy. This was a German psychology movement that rejected a mechanistic view of humans. And see, the problem was people started acting like humans were a car or something. And so if your engine's broken, let's just go in and fix or replace the engine. I mean, that would be hard to do with the brain, right? But that's this idea of we can swap out parts, and everything got reduced down to these bits. And what the Gestalt people are saying, no, it's kind of like this idea of synergy. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The car isn't just all the different parts, it becomes something more than that when it's all put together and running properly. A human isn't just skin and bones and tendons and nerves and organs. We're greater than the sum of our parts. We can't just treat the brain, we have to treat the whole person, right? And I love that holistic approach. And so they were really getting away from that materialistic view and looking at people as subjective individuals. And so definitely influenced by the existentialism happening at the time, and then applying it back into psychology. I think it kind of went out of vogue, but I think the ideas and concepts keep springing up because our age is definitely influenced by existential thought and subjectivity and all of that. I think it's going to be around for a bit. In Gestalt therapy, you're not trying to go in and fix someone, you're acknowledging every individual lives in their own reality. Therapy was intended to help people navigate a world where other people's reality are different from their own. And our culture is our collective reality that we live and move in. And I mentioned last week, the Gestalt therapists aren't trying to tell people they're crazy or mentally ill because they're hearing voices or having hallucinations or have different thought processes than other people. What they're explaining to them is if you want to live and interact in communal culture, there's certain expectations and guidelines. And if you cannot or will not conform to them, you will be incarcerated or institutionalized because of fear or nonconformity. Our society is really big to conformity, which is weird because we always talk individualism, right? Be yourself, just do it, all that. But there's so much pressure to conform to certain norms, whether that's in your religious sect, your educational community. I mean, you could be a punk rocker, right? And there's still expectations to conform to a certain look and attitude and style and music. It's just so weird. Even anarchical groups can have incredible peer pressure to conform to that. And I really like this Gestalt therapy of you're not trying to fix or anything, you're just trying to give people tools if they're able to play with others. And I think there's value in that.